presentation, which hopefully should show. Okay, marvellous. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name's David Banks. I'm a journalist. It sounds like these days it's a bit of an Alcoholics Anonymous confession in this post-Leveson world. And despite what the BBC would have you believe, I am a journalist, not a media lawyer. Media consultant was a bit too taxing for their caption writer, I think. But I was almost a lawyer. I did a law degree. It's way back in the mists of time. And getting towards the end of the degree, I decided I didn't want to actually be a lawyer, which was a little bit of a problem, having done 3 years of a law degree. So, not quite knowing what to do, I ambled into the Students' Union Careers Advisory Service, God help me. And they got me to fill in a thing called a cascade form, which was a massive multiple choice form, about 80 or 90 questions, tick boxes, of various things, interests and preferences and whatnot, which they would then feed into a computer, and out would come a list of suggested careers. So I ticked all the boxes, and then it went into the computer, and out came the list of my careers. And top of the list was air steward, and second on the list was journalist. So on balance, I went for journalism, but if I do need to direct you to the exits, I do know how to do it. I'm well qualified to do it. So that's how I got into journalism, and I went into sort of regional journalism in the northwest of England, doing various jobs, and eventually worked for the Daily Post in Liverpool. And again, started off there as a reporter, worked my way up onto the news desk, and finally I ended up as the night editor of the Daily Post, it being a morning paper, a nighttime operation, and I was in charge of it all. And it was night editing the Post that I learned to worry about the law, because when I'd been a journalist, I'd always been able to leave it to someone higher up the food chain to worry about legal issues. You know, I could put a note on the top of my copy, subs please legal, news desk please check, and I could get them to look at it. But when I was night editing, I found that all those stories with legals on end up on the night editor's desk. So it was karma. It came round to haunt me in the end. Now I had a night lawyer. This guy we paid inordinate sums of money to be available in the evenings to answer legal questions. But he was basically the anti-Del Monte man. He was the man who liked to say no. I could have had him as a macro on my keyboard, night lawyer says no. So most of the time I didn't phone him so that we wouldn't be told not to do something, which is a very risky way to run a newspaper, let me tell you. It's real seat-of-the-pants stuff, but most of the time we stayed out of too much trouble. But night work is a strange occupation. I'd start at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, finish at 3 o'clock in the morning. And eventually the editor of the Daily Post took pity on my vampire-like complexion and packed me off to the company's training centre to go and do 6 months training journalists as secondment up in Newcastle. So off I went. But I liked having a social life so much for the first time in several years. And Newcastle, as I'm sure you're aware, is not a bad city to have a social life in. In fact, I'm convinced Newcastle is a social life masquerading as a city. And so I stayed in training, and that was back in about 1999. And there I ended up writing McNay and doing various other things. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, I took the leap into self-employment, and now I go around the country doing lots of this, talking to people about what they can and can't put out in the public domain. I cling by my fingertips to the idea I'm still a journalist, though, because I still write for The Guardian, the Independent, and Hello magazine, who approached me not too long ago. 500 learned words on the legality of showing royal bosoms in European magazines. I ended up in a 5-way expert piece sandwiched between Andrew Morton, Diana's biographer, and Mariella Frostrup. But I am the go-to guy for legality of nude royals in European publishing. So what I want to talk to today about the kind of law that you might confront and what you need to know, and how it might cause you difficulties. Because I've always maintained, and this is something I learned from Walter Greenwood, the late Walter Greenwood, who I used to work with, that journalists need to know more law than lawyers do. I had the temerity to say this in a blog called Legal Cheek, which circulates to lawyers, and they weren't very happy about that, the suggestion that journalists know more law than lawyers. I wasn't suggesting that we know more law in depth than they do. That's probably not true. But we need to know more breadth of law. There's more that we confront on any given day than any lawyer does in their profession. And so, but they absolutely battered me on this blog. I mean, the sort of hate messages from these people, accusing me of having the arrogance to suggest this. And so I was a bit sort of cowed by this, and I thought, oh well, perhaps I went a bit too far. And then I was sitting on a train one day, on the way down to Birmingham, and there was a guy sitting next to me with, as you can see, a bundle of paper wrapped in pink ribbon, which indicated he was a lawyer. So I struck up conversation with him. So, where are you off? And he was off down to court that day in Birmingham. And I said, all right. And I explained to him what I did, and we had a little chat. And he said, there won't be any journalists where I am. I said, oh, where's that? He said, it's youth court. You're not allowed in. Really? I said, well, I think you'll find that we are allowed in. He said, oh yes. He says you are allowed in, but only with the permission of the magistrates. No, we're definitely allowed in by law. See, he went off scratching his head. So, I was reassured that we actually do know more law than lawyers. So that's what I want to urge you today, to pity the poor reporter who has to work with all this law throughout their career. And we're very much embattled at the moment because of Leveson. We're all portrayed as trilby-clad, dirty overcoat-wearing, foot-in-the-door merchants. Would that we could get out of the office often enough to put our foot in a few doors nowadays. But this is the perception that public have of us, is that we are all trampling over people's privacy and ruining their lives. But in a typical day, I just kind of noted down the sorts of stories a journalist might confront in a typical day in the newsroom. And this is a relatively conservative estimate of the sorts of laws that they need to have a grasp of, the array of legislation. And it's increasing all the time. Barely a day goes by when some bit of legislation will go through Parliament, and there will be something in there. The parliamentary draftsman almost can't resist putting something in there that will impact on media reporting of that particular issue. And they haven't got the first idea of how the media operates, and so they'll mess it up. And so it will be badly framed, and that it will not result in their intended consequence. And this is just when they're dealing with mainstream media. Throw into that new media and social media, and you really mess up their day. And they haven't got the first clue about social media and how that operates, and the impacts their legislation have on communications in that area. So, with all that law sitting on top of us, it is no wonder that we get things wrong on occasion. And as I said, people have this perception of us as invaders of people's privacy. But very often the mistakes that are made, the legal issues that arise, are not as a result of some terrible conspiracy to get people, some terrible desire on the part of the media to ruin people's lives. Most of the time it's not conspiracy. Most of the time it's just a cock-up. Now and again we are out to get people. If you work on certain papers, naming no names, Daily Mail, and you happen to be the leader of the opposition. But most of the time, as I'll talk about now, most of the time things go wrong through a catalogue of blunders. And this is a typical example of that. This is Lee Byron, Jonathan Woodgate, two charming young men who were accused of an assault on a young man called Sarfraz Najib. Now, Mr. Najib's name, as you might imagine, he was of Asian origin. And there was a big debate at the start of their trial as to whether they were going to be charged with racially aggravated assault. So there were weeks of legal arguments in the run-up to the trial because their lawyers were desperate for it not to be charged as a racially aggravated assault. It's a really serious crime. It makes the crime much, much more serious if there's a racially aggravated element to it. Eventually, the judge ruled, right, no racial motive, it's just going to be tried as a normal assault. Okay, so the issue of race was out of the trial, couldn't be mentioned. Trial goes on, And the jury go out, and they went out on a Friday, and they didn't reach their verdict on that Friday. So they were sent home over the weekend. We don't send jurors to hotels anymore or anything like that. They were sent home over the weekend. On the Sunday Mirror ran an interview with Sarfraz Najib's father, okay, in which he said, and they used this as their headline, "If only I'd taken Sarfraz out of this country when I was attacked by racists, then this wouldn't have happened to him." Okay? So there's Dad dumping the issue of race right into the middle of the jury deliberations. Okay? Disaster. Monday morning, the defence point this out to the judge. The judge asks the jurors, he asked them an odd question. He asked them, "Are any of you aware of the Sunday Mirror's coverage?" And one of them put his hand up. He was aware. He hadn't read it, but he was aware of it. But anyway, the judge took that to mean the jury were contaminated. End of the trial abandoned at a cost of anything between £1 and £6 million, depending on whose estimates you believe. A complete disaster. Sunday Mirror done for contempt of court. Its then editor, Colin Myler, falls on his sword and resigns. Now, that's bad enough, but when you hear why it happened, it gets worse. And like I said, you might see this as the Sunday Mirror, terrible paper, flouting contempt laws deliberately messing up a trial, just for readers. But if you looked at the Sunday Mirror that day, there was no mention of this story on their front page. It wasn't blurbed anywhere. So it wasn't even something they thought would gain them sale. But what happened was, they'd signed up Sarfraz Najib's dad. It was a buy-up. Okay, they paid money for the interview. But the deal was in Canary Wharf that if the trial didn't finish on a Friday, that the Daily Mirror would get the interview. Okay, that was the deal, so that it was best for Mirror Group as a whole. But the Sunday Mirror hated their sister paper, the Daily, so much they wanted to run this without the Daily getting it. And so they sat down with the lawyers and say, "How can we use this?" And the lawyers looked at it and they were, "Blimey, you can't." But they went through it with a red pen, took out a load of material and said, "It's just about safe." Okay? At some point in the production process, someone pushed the wrong button and all of the lawyers' extractions went back into the story. Okay? Cock up. It then went out and it went ballistic, as you might say. So it was just a cock-up, and it was just a silly intercompany rivalry, just a ridiculous situation, not some deliberate act on the part of the Sunday Mirror to mess up a trial. But when blunders come, they come in battalions. I hope you know this, but there's a new crime created in 2003 called Trafficking for the Purposes of Sexual Exploitation. And it's a sexual offence. If you move someone from one country to another to put them into a brothel, into sexual slavery, it's a sexual offence. A person who's a victim of that offence gets anonymity for life. Okay. New offence, 2003, which unfortunately the Lancashire Evening Post wasn't aware of. So some copy arrived on the news desk from what they thought was a brothel-keeping trial in Preston. And the two prosecution witnesses who were named in the copy at a brothel in Preston were from Brazil, okay, in Preston. Now, I would hope that the journalistic instincts you've developed on this course would have led you, as I'm sure they would have led me, to look at that copy on my screen and think, there's a bit of a story here, isn't there? Brazil to Preston. I don't believe women sit on Ipanema Beach saying, "I've heard the streets of Preston are paved with gold." You know? As they say on the X Factor, these women have been on a journey, you know. And as a journalist, it's worth asking a few questions about, because after all, that is our job, to ask questions. Unfortunately, no questions were asked. The copy was whacked up onto the LEP's website, where it was picked up by Brazilian media, where the women's families who didn't know of their life of shame disowned them as a result. As if it's not miserable enough being whisked by force from South America to a brothel in Preston. You've then got your family not talking to you anymore because the LEP has named you in this trial. And the LEP were prosecuted for that as a result of that particular mistake. And contempt. We've seen this, the envelope pushed on this as well. In this particular story, which was a perfect storm of a story. Happened at Christmas when there's not a lot else going on apart from snow, or floods this year, but snow that year. Okay, a young victim, a young female victim who Terrible thing to say, but will get more attention than any other kind of victim. It's one of the kind of truths of tabloid reporting of crime. Briefings being held by the police, okay, off the record briefings, and an oddball suspect, Chris Jeffries, who's a bit strange, okay, but we are a nation that produces eccentrics, and unfortunately for Chris Jeffries, he is one of them, okay. Comb over, blue rinse, maybe gay, definitely a killer then. You know, ticks all the boxes in the eyes of the papers. Who monstered him? We see, you know, just some of the coverage here. And, you know, the poor guy, he was a former teacher, and all of his ex-pupils came out of the woodwork. You know, I've got a few ex-teachers I'd like to say a few things about if they were ever accused of something, but his ex-pupils came out of the woodwork and said, oh, I always knew he was a bit creepy. And one of the papers ran that, 120 point, creepy, as their headline, in advance of any trial. I mean, he didn't even get to trial. He wasn't even charged. He was only ever arrested. It wasn't him. It was her neighbour, you know. But they went for it. You know, it has to be said, the briefings by the police probably helped in that. But they went for it and got it wrong. Contempt prosecutions, a raft of libel prosecutions. Okay, so always ask questions. You know, if everyone's telling you something's true, this is what was happening in this case. And the police were saying, we've got our man. So your job as a journalist to say, is that really right? You know, don't always take their word for it. But in case you want to accuse me of being holier than thou and betraying other people's mistakes, I'll illustrate how badly wrong things can go and how easily wrong things can go by mistake with a story sadly involving my own efforts for the Daily Post. And this is when I was working for the Daily Post as a reporter in Cheshire. There's a tale of the fantastically alliteratively named Pollyanna Pete, who was a member of Frodsham Silver Band. Frodsham is a town in leafy Cheshire. And Frodsham Silver Band, unbeknownst to the people of Frodsham, was a hotbed of illicit passion. And Pollyanna, who was in her 20s, was having a torrid affair, as affairs always are, with a fellow band member some 40 years older than her. And after band practice, they would adjourn to Frodsham Marshes, a local beauty spot, where in his roomy estate car they would consummate their passion for one another. One night, he died during his exertions. Now, how did I get to know about this on the Daily Post? Well, I wasn't dogging on Frodsham Marshes. Innocent age. Dogging hadn't been invented then. It came up on the police calls. These were the glorious days when you did the police calls and actually got to speak to a human being instead of a recorded voice bank. And human beings, as you will soon find out, as you may well know already, human beings can't resist a bit of gossip. And so the station sergeant at Frodsham said, well, we've had a sudden death on Frodsham Marshes, and you'll never guess how. Now, she was in custody because the police were alleging there'd been a lover's tiff, that she'd slapped him and this had caused his fatal heart attack. She was insisting, no, he died in the act of love. So for us on the Daily Post, it was the perfect story. We had a new editor at the time, and the editor's mission statement for the Daily Post was that he wanted it to be the Daily Mail of the North. And for the Daily Mail of the North, this is the perfect story. It's got sex, it's got death caused by sex, and it's got a brass band in it as well. It's just fantastic. So me and a photographer belted out to Frodsham and got to the bandmaster before word had spread of how this guy had died. So we got a chat with the bandmaster, and crucially, we got a picture of the band. And there on the back row is the dead bloke, the trombonist in the band, if you need to know. You have to have this sort of detail. And on the front row centre is Pollyanna Pete, literally the femme fatale of Frodsham Silver Band. So we were delighted. Got the story, got the picture, off it goes for printing in the next day's Daily Post. I got the paper the next day. It's one of those moments you occasionally have in journalism, and you will have them, where I opened the paper and I closed it immediately, wanting what I saw not to be true. Because on the far right of the picture, there had been a guy sitting on the front row. There had been a guy sitting slightly off to the side of the band. He wasn't in the main grouping. And it made the outline of the band a slightly awkward dog-leg shape. And so the page designer, to neaten up the band into a neat rectangle, cropped off the guy sitting on the right. But when the caption's already been written, Pollyanna Pete, fourth from the right, and you crop off someone on the right-hand side, it shifts the identification along, doesn't it? So instead of pointing the finger of blame at Pollyanna Pete, we pointed the finger of blame at the 16-year-old schoolgirl standing next to her. So you can now imagine the libel action heading at us like an express train. You know, for the claimants, you have sweet, innocent 16-year-old schoolgirl never done a thing wrong in her life. And for the defence, you have the grubby hacks in the Daily Post who can't even put a picture in a paper properly. You know, every time the jury looked at us, they'd have put another 0 on the damages they would have inflicted on us. Now, we got out of this, and this is a lesson for the future. Sometimes it's best to say, sorry, we got out of it in a way lawyers would tell you never do. Lawyers would say, sit tight, wait for them to contact you. But the editor wasn't having any of that. This was a disaster. He'd only been weeks in position, and already he's libelling 16-year-old schoolgirls. So he wrote a letter of apology to the family that day. Didn't wait for them to contact us. And so we took the letter of apology round. Now, Dad wasn't a happy man, as you might imagine. Here he is, his daughter's 16 years old. She's not pregnant, she's not on drugs, she's not in a death metal band, she's a member of the local silver band, she's every father's vision of perfection. And here you have the Daily Post that day telling the people of Frodsham that she kills elderly men with sex. So he's a bit miffed. But in typical British middle-class fashion, he invites us in for a cup of tea, and he said, look, what we do depends on how upset she is. We'll see how she reacts when she gets home from school. So we had a very nervous wait then for this girl to come home from school. She came home from school, took one look at the Daily Post and burst out laughing. Thought it was hilarious. And she didn't think anyone would take it seriously. So they didn't even want an apology in the paper. They thought it would draw more attention to the original story. Now, the difference now, we wouldn't get away with that now, because now, by first break that day, her life would have been made a misery on social media. It would have been Facebooked and tweeted to death. And this is one of the issues you have with social media now. It'll amplify and aggravate the things that you do. You know, I got away with it. You know, my paper got away with it. I'm denying any responsibility. I didn't use the scissors on the picture. But we got away with it. But now that social media engagement can push people into legal action to nail the lie of what you've done. It makes people more keen to take action. So it was a lucky escape for us. So online, you know, this is the real change you've got from, you know, in legal issues, is the online engagement you engage in journalism. And online engagement has huge strengths: the speed with which you can communicate with people, the volume of material you can put out there, the reach. You can go round the world now. You're no longer constrained by geographical footprints and distribution footprints. It persists as well. It's there forever, for as long as you host it on your servers. And you are no longer, we've broken away from this kind of top-down model of engagement with our audiences, where we decide what the news is and our readership have got to like it or lump it. You are now in a dialogue. They tell us what they're interested in, and they react to the things that we publish. They contribute to the things that we publish. There's much more a democratization of the relationship. So these are fantastic strengths of online engagement and online publication. And the weaknesses are just the same. The speed with which you publish means you can't check it. You haven't got time to check things. The volume means there's a greater chance there's something in there that someone doesn't like. It reaches people who will take some sort of legal objection to it. And because it persists, it's there forever. People find the material that's been written about them. You know, when I was starting out as a journalist, I had the safety net of the fact that it was chip paper the next day. Well, people don't find legals in chip paper. Okay? They do online, though. They Google themselves, and they find what's been written about them, and then they might engage their lawyers. And the dialogue is a real problem, because you are in dialogue with the general public, who you will soon find out are mad, you know. And they don't care about the law. They don't think it applies to them. And they will sometimes engage you in conversations which sometimes will get you in some sort of legal liability. And even where they're engaging you and you have no legal liability, the courts will sometimes think you do. Only a couple of months ago, I was working with the Manchester Evening News. They'd been summoned to court by a judge because someone had mentioned the Manchester Evening News in a tweet in which they'd named a victim of a sexual offence. And the judge reading it saw the Manchester News Twitter handle in there and thought they were responsible for it. So the reporter had to go to court and go into the witness box to explain Twitter to the judge. You know, we can't help it if they use our name. But this is what you're dealing with. You're dealing with a judiciary and a political system and a political establishment who don't understand social media. A great many of them don't understand social media at all. You understand it far, far better than they do. You know, you'll be using platforms, you'll be using things that they haven't got the first inkling about. And yet they're creating law, which has an impact on what you do. So, you have these issues of speed and reach and permanence. Are you using social media as part of your media operation? Who do you give access to? Who uses it in your organisation? You know, increasingly, newspapers have slowly come to do this, but some of them are doing quite creative things with their social media accounts. The Sunday People, for instance, the Sunday People is quite a traditional red-top tabloid in print, but online it's been quite adventurous in some of the things it's done in digital media, and in particular in its Twitter feed. It's quite clever. What it does is very often it farms out its feed to other tweeters. People who they might be freelancers, they might be people who work for it, but they're people who are just funny. And the Sunday People will get them to say, someone will do a shift on the Sunday People's Twitter feed, say just tweeting during the X Factor. And so they get the people to do that. And there's one guy they got to do it on a football match in the North East, and he's tweeting for them on this football match. And as normally happens at the start of the football game, the teams get led out with their mascot for that week, local little kid. And this little lad's leading out one of the teams. And he's in the strip of his team. And he's got a backpack on, rucksack on. And the guy who was tweeting for the Sunday People thought this was funny. Started gently poking fun, nothing really nasty, but just poking fun at the lad. What's he doing with the rucksack on? He could have left that in the changing room, couldn't he? And he did a hashtag, campaign for real mascots. It's all kind of very jocular. Didn't notice the tweets coming back at him from people in that area who were informing the little lad's quite well known in that region. He's got a very rare medical condition where he's being fed via a tube through his heart via this device that he has to carry on in this backpack 24 hours a day. So in terms of, now there's nothing legal there, but in terms of brand reputation and damage, it was disastrous. It's just a few ill-judged tweets had done to the Sunday People. Now, very often, you may well be going out there, working for various organisations, engaging on social media as journalists, and you may see this line in your bio, tweeting in a personal capacity. My views, not those. The BBC are very fond of this. My views, not those of the BBC. Okay, it has no meaning in employment law at all. If you tweet something that's gross misconduct, you're out of the door. Okay. In my view as well, it has no meaning in defamation, privacy, and other laws like that. I think we're going to see some test cases here. Because if you're tweeting away, promoting your employer on your personal Twitter feed, and you then tweet something defamatory, okay, a claimant lawyer isn't going to look at that and think, oh, damn, they've got the line in there, it's their personal views, not those of the BBC. They're going to think, hang on, 30 tweets promoting BBC work and then one defamatory of my clients. Their tweeting is clearly part of their employment and the BBC has a liability for it. They're not going to give up that easily. So be careful. If you are mixing that personal and online and professional stuff, be careful in that. So how much damage can one tweet do? Well, we've seen all of these legal issues raised in social media engagement in the past 12 to 18 months. Libel, contempt, data protection issues, privacy, copyright, children and sexual offences. People are doing time as a result of things that they put on social media. People have got suspended prison sentences, very high fines. The law is entering in there. The Attorney General, Dominic Griever, said he will come after bloggers, he will come after tweeters if they commit contempt. And he has done. We've seen all of this happen. So who's to blame? Where does liability lie? Well, it lies with an individual tweeter. Fantastic. But frequently they're not worth suing. Individuals aren't worth suing for libel unless they're very rich individuals. The platforms themselves, Twitter, Blogger, Facebook, they have liability, but they've usually got a get-out clause. If they remove stuff as soon as they're notified of it, they're safe. So then that leaves the organisations who are employers. They're the ones who are worth taking action against. They're the ones who are worth suing. And so if you're in that chain, if you're an employee in that chain, perhaps you've retweeted something, then your employer might have a liability. If you're tweeting as part of your work, your employer might have a liability, and that's going to potentially cost you your employment. So what's coming up? Well, we've got the Defamation Act 2013, which has just come into force. It came into force on January the 1st this year. A number of changes in there, some very beneficial to us. Public interest defence, which we'll see tested by the courts. We'll see how that works, whether it's as god-awfully difficult as the Reynolds defence or whether it's simpler. time limit for online publication, which is great benefit to online publishers. No longer have you got this open-ended libel threat. You've got 12 months to sue for online publication as well as print publication from now on. Claimants have to show serious harm to their reputation. Companies have to show financial damage. So things that are really beneficial to us in the Defamation Act. A new regulator, whose shape I've given up guessing. IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organisation, will start operation on the 1st of May. Whether politically it's going to be acceptable and whether we see it becoming our new regulator as a press regulator remains to be seen. The victim side organisations like Hacked Off are very much against it. They say it's the PCC Mark II. It's still the industry regulating itself. The industry say, no, it's different. It can conduct investigations. It will be able to levy financial penalties of up to £1 million. So they say it's different. So there's a political battle that's going to be waged over this. I suspect the press want IPSO up and running for a year by the next election. It might have conducted some investigations, levied some financial penalties, so by the time we get a new government in 2015, they're going to be able to say, you know, why mess with it? Why mess with something that's not broken? And the big challenge for you is adapting to the online world, you know, and the challenges that poses to us legally. The third biggest nation in the world is, anyone? Facebook. Facebook is the third biggest country in the world now, if you could treat Facebook as a country. And that gives you an idea of the scale. And that's the scale that our legislators haven't got a grip of. The sheer numbers of people who are now engaged on social media and the speed with which social media is changing people's lives. But the challenges have been there all along. You know, the changes in which social media and online engagement were going to be has been there for years. I mean, I've been banging on about contempt for years and the challenge that online publication poses. When I was working up in Newcastle, a guy went up on trial called David Bieber, charged with killing a police officer. And lots of warnings were issued to say nothing about, you know, the media must say nothing about his past, nothing whatsoever about his background. And everyone was complying, all the mainstream media were complying. So I did a little test. That evening I went home and, you know, pretended I was a juror. I Googled his name, David Bieber. The number one hit on Google was an American website, which courts in this country can't do anything about. An American website called America's Most Wanted, which revealed that David Bieber had already committed a murder in Florida. So that's the issue. You know, we have now, our communications are now international, and there's nothing the law can do about that. But I'd urge you not to forget, you know, in this kind of swathe of digital media, online engagement, and the miracles that it can do for us as journalists, not to forget that this job is fundamentally quite simple. It's about finding stories and telling them. And you see this in the joy of court and the sort of case you come across and the stories that you come across just by sitting in a courtroom and seeing how completely incompetent most criminals are. Such as one who was found with a van containing several bales of cannabis worth something in excess of £1.5 million. He denied all knowledge of the contents of the van. He just picked up the van for a friend. He didn't know that the cannabis was in the bag. Unfortunately for him, alongside him in the passenger seat was his girlfriend, who was a bit of an enthusiastic diarist and had been keeping a diary of where they'd visited and what they'd dropped off at the various places, which rather did for his defence. And then I remember one of the first court cases I ever went to, and it was a young man who was accused of a very common offence in those days, taking and driving away. And it was a case that I wouldn't normally pay attention to, and so I was slumbering gently on the press bench in the magistrate's court. And the prosecution started explaining the case to the magistrate, and they said, yes, it's an unusual case, Your Honours. This man had taken and driven away an ambulance. thought, oh my God, what's this then? So I started flipping through the court lists, because they normally nick Golf GTIs, and this guy had nicked an ambulance. So I found his name on the court list, started taking a note. And then the defence got up for some mitigation. They said, it's a very sad case, Your Honours. His girlfriend had left him because he was unemployed. And he thought that if she saw him driving around town in an ambulance, she'd thought he'd got a good job and she'd take him back. So from a nothing story on the court list, it becomes a story of boy gets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets ambulance, boy loses liberty. So always remember that it's the story that counts, which I think just about draws me to a conclusion. This is me, website, email, and my Twitter handle. Unless you have any questions for me at all out there. Well, I think that's a real challenge for the law, and because if you looked 20 years ago, the only people who could effectively get that sort of message out to a large audience were mainstream broadcasters and the mainstream press. But now, the complete change that we've had in the past 5 to 10 years has been the fact that now all of a sudden everyone's a publisher. Everyone's got lots and lots of people got Facebook accounts, they've got Twitter accounts, they've got blogs, and the law is treating them in the same way as publishers at the moment. Now, I'm not sure I'm entirely comfortable with that personally, because I think I look at tweets and Twitter and Facebook and things like that differently from the way I might look at the Guardian or the Daily Telegraph or BBC News. I just think they're qualitatively different. But the law isn't particularly seeing that, and so people are criminalising themselves. Now, the Law Commission is saying that they think there should be a wide-scale review of the way in which the law relates to online publication and in particular social media. Because we have got this issue with large sections of the public now publishing, but they've got absolutely no knowledge whatsoever of the law. And I think we're still sort of feeling our way. But I think it is a big issue to come, really. No. Mm. Yeah. Well, I certainly hope so. The questions about trolling and whether some trolling is abusive but not necessarily legally actionable, but whether the law might start going into that. I think that the CPS have tried to rein themselves in a little bit, because I think early on they were taking prosecutions where people were just getting a little bit offended by what was being put about them online, and they've now started they've issued guidelines about when action should be tripped by social media activity. I hope the law doesn't go down that road, because I think we can't have a law about not being against being offended. But that seems to be some people's attitude, that if something nasty is said about them on social media, then they should be able to somehow call the police and have these people banged up. But I think sometimes it's easy for us to take. Once you take seriously things like the threats of violence and things like this, sort of thing we saw happen to Caroline Criado Perez over the banknote campaign and stuff like that, certainly. The threats that were made to her are completely unacceptable. But sometimes you will get people on social media who will be complaining of what they say, what they regard as some sort of criminal behaviour, but when you actually look at it, it's insulting, it might be unpleasant, but it falls far short of what you regard as criminal. If it was said to you in the pub, it wouldn't give rise to any sort of criminal action. And I think we should try to restrain ourselves from thinking that the law should deal with any sort of unpleasant behaviour on social media, because basically we will fill the courts with people who are doing daft things on Twitter and Facebook if we go down that road. And the police have got enough to do without having to police our every posting on social media as well. So I certainly hope we won't go down that direction. They can get the same solution. Yeah, I do think there is sometimes a hysteria that exists on social media, which, like I said, if someone said something to you in the street, you'd just, it would be, either might be banter or it might be something you would regard as unpleasant, but not necessarily something that should be going to court. But you're right, the celebrities can sometimes, they have got the wherewithal, they've got the legal representation to overreact. And then that sets an example thing, maybe makes people think everyone can get that solution, when they clearly can't. I mean, I'm a great fan of social media being self-policing. That as well as the trolls, you also get the people who support their friends and their contacts on social media and tackle that kind of abusive behaviour on social media, and I think that's a far more sensible solution than involving the courts and the police and things like that. It is. I mean, it's a strength that if you publish something online, you can undo it. You can correct it very quickly. So that is a strength. But as you say, sometimes it will have already got away from you. The original publication will have been repeated, screenshotted, and so you have got the advantages of deletion, but you've also got the disadvantages of the ease with which it's copied. So at the moment, it's not really working out as especially different from print publication in terms of the impact. But I would say, if you publish something online and you've definitely got it wrong, prompt correction is the route to go down, because it can undo so many things, and it can certainly reduce any ultimate financial penalties but very substantially. So and that's what I think is one of the great advantages of online publishing, is that you can have a more honest form of publication where you are accepting that things go wrong, reacting quickly and setting the record straight in a prominent way, and I think online publishers should take advantage of that. Any others? Oh, sorry, hello.
How much legislation go about prosecuting somebody who had posted anonymous abuse? Because I think it's been applied anonymous abuse.
Yeah. That's right. Well, it's a fiction to think that you are really anonymous online. I mean, this is one of the undoings of the people who attacked Caroline Criado Perez. I mean, they had created false identities, but the fact is that and I'm not trying to advise you on how to do this, actually. The only way to be truly anonymous is to go into an internet cafe with cash, and and in disguise as well. So if there's any CCTV, you can't be recognised. And set up some sort of Hotmail account or something like that, and you then set up the personalities online. Wear gloves so you don't leave fingerprints on the keyboards as well. You have to go to extraordinary lengths. Most people don't do that. They just do it from their phone, but they think they've set up an anonymous account. The fact is, you're not. I mean, your devices leave fingerprints. They've got an IP address which can be traceable. Now, what a claimant has to do then is go to court, and they get a thing called the Norwich Pharmacal order. And it's an order of the court for the ISP or the platform provider or someone like that to divulge that address, that detail. And that gives the forces of law and order, or the person taking a civil claim, the ability to identify you, or identify the device. And once you've identified the device, very often you can identify the individual who did it. So it's a myth to think that people are doing things anonymously. A great deal of the time they're not. Now, there are some people who are. There are some people who are, who go to great lengths to anonymise themselves, but most people don't, and the law catches up with them when they do. Hello, back there.
Following on from what the other person said, what about the uses of VPN and tunneling? And, you know, if you can hide behind something like that, it's obviously it's difficult to infiltrate people use VPN. How will the law work with VPN?
Well, I mean, undoubtedly, you know, that's a challenge for the law going forward, is to the way in which they might tackle technology. It's always the case, as with all sort of criminality, that, you know, there'll be people who are technologically adept who will stay a couple of steps ahead, and it'll take a while for the law to catch up with the technical ways in which they're committing offences. They eventually do, though, but then they'll come up with some new way of committing an offence. The fact is that the vast majority of people don't go to that length. The vast majority of people just think, right, I'll set up a Hotmail address and I'll set up a fake profile on Twitter, and then I can do what I like, and then all of a sudden they've got police knocking on their door. So most people don't go to those lengths. Some do, and it takes more effort for the forces of law in order to catch up with them if they ever can. But most people don't go to those lengths, I think. Anyone else? All done? Okay, thank you.